32, Double Dutch, Part 2 of New Amsterdam's Influence on American Food. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the early British colonists showing up with so few solid ideas and plans left them open to people who did have plans and solid ideas when it came to setting up farms and organizing cities. In this case, how the 17th century colony of New Amsterdam, which officially existed for fewer than 50 years, was able to leave so many lasting legacies on American food and American food commerce. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know about the lasting Dutch influence on American food is that while the printed 17th century English cookbooks were for rich people and were full of elaborate recipes that required an army of scullery maids, piles of spices, and a wall full of copper pots and bronze kettles, the Dutch 17th century printed cookbooks were for middle-class people, contained sensible recipes we would find possible and even tasty today, and were already paired with information on building a better stove in your new house and how to set up and cultivate a kitchen garden. This said a few important things about the Dutch. Unlike the English, more than just the very rich were learning to read. So was the middle class, and not just at church-run institutions. What's more, the Dutch middle class were buying books, largely because they could, and unlike in England, there was a far greater variety of books to buy. In 16th and 17th century Holland, printing presses were common and reasonably unregulated. In England, they were rare and closely monitored by the government, which had a lot to do with why the separatist Puritans we call Pilgrims hung out in Leiden on their way to Massachusetts. The Dutch were printing books for the middle class. Stories, scientific tracts, and books on sensible gardening practices were available, while English presses leaned into approved religious texts and books aimed at the wealthy, which is where we come into our narrative. The earliest British colonists were pretty anti-fish and seafood and fairly anti-vegetable when they arrived in North America. As I talked about earlier, sure, they ate fish, cauliflower, and beans, but appreciation for these things and the pursuit of them was generally much lower on the average English colonist list than some good beef and wheat. But beef and wheat were rare, so fish, crabs, and squash wedges were eaten. But it wasn't what people were writing home about, except maybe to complain. The Dutch colonists, on the other hand, because of their highly communal effort to create and guard farmland from the sea, were more equitable when it came to land ownership. This meant the middle class was a much wider band in Dutch society than it was in England. Yes, there was a tippy-tippy top, and there were landless laborers, criminals, and various scoundrels, but a much larger proportion of the population owned their own land. While the constant battle with the sea had its drawbacks, it did mean that the Dutch were more in touch with seafood as part of their diet. As I alluded to last time, the Netherlands, also referred to as the Low Countries or Les Pays-Bas, owed a fair part of their current existence to people literally lifting dirt up from brackish swamps, building ditches to drain it, and making it into farmland, because their ancestors had literally been forced off all the other northern land that was farmable. When people talk about the Dutch building their country, they mean the actual dirt in many cases, which also explains why they have spent so much time and treasure developing and building dikes and other walls to protect their country from the sea. The Deltawerk system of barriers along the North Sea is the most recent iteration of this, and it is truly impressive. As an aside, the islands they constructed to build this thing are now a pretty fun museum and amusement park. There'll be links in the show notes. Anyway, because of the intensely effortful nature of Dutch land, both keeping it and cultivating it meant much more land was in the hands of small-holding farmers, and far less was all clumped together in the hands of a few large landowners. As a result, More people were farm owners, so there were many more people contributing to the idea of what it meant to run a successful farm. Also, due to the fact that fewer Dutch people were destitute landless peasants or homeless day laborers, a higher proportion of the Dutch than the English could read, write, and do arithmetic. This partially led to the atmosphere where more books were published and more ideas were easily spread. The spread of religious ideas gets all the ink in the history books, but ideas on cultivating fruit, vegetable and flower varieties, and animal breeds, especially dairy cows and pigs, got quite a bit of book space and airtime in the 17th century. Grafting better apples or breeding a better milk cow weren't just the pursuits of rich guy large landowners as it was in England. Many a successful smallholder would exchange ideas for a tighter head of cauliflower, a striped beet, a sweeter carrot, or a better piglet. Then there was the fact that unlike in England, where much of the country is easily several days' walk away from the coast, most of the Dutch world was in contact with the sea daily. For many of them, it was over the next wall or maybe over the next low hill. This meant that many a Dutch farmer likely spent at least part of their life also messing about in boats, even if just for moving produce to market or picking up supplies. And just about every Dutch person spent some of their time fishing, catching eels, or harvesting shellfish, clams, mussels, oysters, and so on. While most English people had only encountered smoked, pickled, or salted fish, the Dutch people regularly interacted with fresh seafood along with the preserved kind. Another consequence of a larger proportion of the population living in the middle class meant that in everyday food, there was simply a wider variety of ingredients available to a larger portion of the population. In England, you were basically very rich or very poor. For the rich, you ate beef and wheat bread, swans from the moat of your castle, and gilded your artichokes. Then to really show off, you also ate imported fancy stuff like lemons, sugar, spices, and sweet potatoes, and had banquets where you cooked peacocks and had them served with all the feathers reinserted. Because you wanted to show off being rich, there wasn't much bother with sensible things. The royalty and nobility were always borrowing money and being hounded by bootmakers, and yes, saying nasty things about the Jews they owed lots of money to because they just did not seem to understand that they had a budget. Side note here, Jews were often involved in finance because of a weird European combination of being systematically hounded out of most other professions and papal technicalities regarding the lending of money. Anyway, worry about a budget? Why would they? Rarely did any noble power wielder face any consequences for being bad with money. Sure, some of them were deposed and lost their heads and stuff, but that barely ever happened. Most of them simply squeezed their peasants all the harder. The poor had barely anything, so were scraping by with peas, whole grain pottages, mushrooms, and other foraged items in season, turnips, those creepy-looking scarrots, and a small assortment of hardy vegetables like cauliflower and leeks. There was some dairy running around, along with the occasional poached rabbit or preserved fish. So they just threw together whatever they had at the moment. So it was all, as I've said earlier, pretty much stew. The Dutch, on the other hand, had a much smaller and flatter set of royalty and nobility. And they were also faced with a merchant class that did keep books and could force consequences on to the nobility if they did go into too much debt. The towns of commoners actually had effective powers when facing down people who claimed divine rights, at some remove. And there just weren't as many landless peasants. It's an interesting consequence of people literally digging their own farms up out of the sea. Defending a farm from the encroaching North Sea is a lot of work and is best taken on by the people who really want to do it. All this backstory is to say, the 17th century Dutch had a much larger middle class than the English did, and as a result had an impressively varied style of regular practical cooking that was also highly skilled and tasty. And because of the higher literacy rate among this wider band of middle class, the cooking of the middle is much better recorded than it was in England. The The craziest thing, as far as I'm concerned, a whole lot of 17th century Dutch cookery looks not just palatable, but even familiar as food today. With the English, it seems to be either catch as catch canned stews if you were poor, or crazy 38-ingredient concoctions of meat, fruit, spices, and crusts if you were rich. With the Dutch, the cooking found in their 17th century cookbooks was practical and mostly tasty looking to the modern American eye. And this is the style of cookery that was established on the island of Manhattan, in the colony of New Amsterdam, and all along the Hudson Valley by this first round of Dutch colonists. And it was this level of tastiness and practicality that would spread out from what was about to be New York. It made its mark on Yankee cuisine first, but spread as America embraced its ethos of plentiful, practical, and bountiful food, and eschewed the overly fancy, fussy, and foreign. Through looking into this more, I can't help but wonder if the Dutch fascination with and acceptance of a few tasty things from afar didn't inform the 20th century split personality over foreign food as both spicy and weird, but also, I want pizza, a burrito, chow mein, and some fried fish. So what was the food scene in New Amsterdam, and how did it get that way? Last time I mentioned the tasty, snacky bread things, pancakes, waffles, cookies, and the arrival of deep frying with the doughnuts. And yeah, in the 17th century, they really were sort of walnut-sized dollops of fried dough. But now it's time to take a deeper look at what the full food scene looked like outside of snack time. Because the Dutch purposely packed farmers in their starter set and did things like city planning and dedicated work on the wharves to make them efficient and functional entrepôts, since this was to be a trading venture, it meant that unlike the early English footholds, starvation and death from bad water were not common. And because diplomacy and functional trade agreements were priorities for the Dutch, conflicts with the original inhabitants of Manhattan and death due to said conflicts with the locals were also uncommon. Instead, New Amsterdam was setting up breweries, bakeries, butcher shops, including a kosher deli, and houses of worship of several stripes, along with settler cabins, taverns, and trading posts from the jump. A healthy local farm economy, along with being on the global grocery delivery trade routes, meant that the New Amsterdam diet looked quite a bit like the Dutch menus back home. Though definitely with no rice, which was present in 17th century Holland, and with a lot more corn and a lot more wild game. As a recipient of the United States educational system, I did not learn much about what the rest of Europe was up to at the time the English were dipping their toes into this New World thing. It was only later that I learned that the Spanish and Portuguese had been in South America for a good long while by 1620, and had already built some really big stone buildings, mainly churches and government buildings, and burned and blasted a bunch of already existing impressive structures they had found when they had arrived, as well as doing in large swaths of local populations. The Dutch also had toeholds all over the place pre-1620. So unlike the English, they were rather practiced at successfully setting up a self-sustaining and hopefully profitable overseas outpost. This means it has taken some personal mental reshuffling to understand that into the second half of the 17th century, while the English colonies were still just getting going and often barely hanging on, eating corn and wishing for beer made out of something other than pumpkin, drinking from communal boiled leather pitchers and eating off of tables with shallow depressions in lieu of plates with their hands, the Dutch had wheat bread, real beer, nice spoons, imported Majolica pottery dishes, and plates imported from Italy. As the English colonists were grousing about the corn and rye and corn and pumpkin breads because they'd neglected to pack farmers and bakers, New Amsterdam had several bakeries turning out traditional wheat flour baked goods. Now this is partly known because in 1649, the New Amsterdam government issued rules to the bakeries to get them to stop using their delicious wheaten-baked goods to trade for the furs the Dutch West India Company, or GWC, was trying to scoop up. Mainly, the GWC was mad that they had to pay higher prices to the Dutch citizens who had used tasty pretzels and buns enriched with egg and butter as barter for furs, instead of allowing the GWC a monopoly. While the complaint was written about the misdistribution of wheat flour, it was the GWC grousing that they couldn't have everything their own way. Quote, "Through a lust and desire of great profits, the Indians and barbarous natives are provided with the best in preference to the Christian nation." Unquote. And that was not the end of it, for in March 1653, a group of 6 bakers petitioned to be allowed to sell white bread, pretzels, and cookies to the locals. The petition was refused in May of the same year, and fines were issued. Meat in New Amsterdam was much more common for a greater portion of its population than it was for the English back in Europe. And this continued in the colonies. The Dutch, like the German colonists in Pennsylvania, tended to travel in family groups, or specifically as prospective farmers. The need for and use of indentured servants and slaves as farm workers was far lower in these areas. This meant the people working the land were more likely to be included in the family meals and, as a result, ate more varied meals that included more complete nutrition generally and more animal protein sources specifically. Birds and fish made up a huge part of the animal protein sources, and the list of species commonly eaten by the middle class is rather extensive. Birds included not just the geese, pigeons, turkeys, and the variety of ducks we've already covered, but heron, bitterns, pheasants, grouse, partridge, woodcock, and quail, and even rather tiny birds like lapwings, larks, starlings, and finches. Fish were divided into 3 categories: preserved, that is, salted, smoked, dried, and pickled, then fresh sea fish, and fresh river fish. Preserved fish included the familiar cod, shad, mackerel, sprat, salmon, and haddock, along with others. The list of ocean fish includes the familiar cod, haddock, halibut, turbot, whiting, plaice, sole, and sardine, as well as shellfish like lobster, oysters, mussel, and crab, but a few less familiar things like dab, weaver, and ray, and the oddly included cormorant, which is a diving bird. Though based on its oily fish diet, likely it was cooked and flavored similarly to a fish. The river fish included several anadromous species, that is, the ones that live in the sea but spawn in fresh water, salmon, sturgeon, eels, smelt, and lamprey, and several others that seem most at home in brackish bodies rather than purely freshwater environs like shrimp, perch, carp, bream, pike, tench, gudgeon, and roach. When it came to game meat, the Dutch leaned more on hare, rabbits, and wild boar than deer, though they did have a few recipes for venison. Farm meats were similar to the English, with beef or ox, veal, mutton, and pork, which all found spots on the table. And all of these recipes included quite a few options for the offals, plucks, or lights of these animals. Things like the lungs, stomachs, feet, tendons, head, and tripes. Where the Dutch start to noticeably veer off from the English table is in the use of meatballs. Even in the 17th century, there are recipes for these 2 to 3 pound or about a kilo-sized balls of chopped meats mixed with breadcrumbs and spices and served as a meat course with a jus or sauce made from the liquid they were boiled and then stewed in. These gehaktballen, or chopped meatballs, were a way to use a bit of this and that. So a meatball of combined meats, say mutton or pork and beef, was not uncommon. In fact, meatballs, as the Dutch did them, are a curious middle ground between sausages, which required the group work of sausage making, and the large chunks of meat roasted, boiled, or stewed that required lots of money to acquire said large chunks of meat. The other interesting thing about a cuisine that includes meatballs in the days before refrigeration, it requires an active butcher class that is regularly harvesting animals and more importantly, distributing meat amongst a larger number of people. English colonists did periodic butcherings and then stored the surplus meat as jerky and smoked bacon. At the same time, the Dutch had a town with butchers, at least one of which was kosher. 1660 was the year New Amsterdam got its first kosher butcher, Asher Levy. Mr. Levy was definitely one of these guys from the age of exploration that can't be kept down. He just kept popping up in the records. He moved to Holland from Lithuania. He was in Dutch Brazil before he departed ahead of the Portuguese and their Inquisition-y ways when they took over the Dutch colony there. He arrived in New Amsterdam around 1655, and in just a few years went from arguing with Peter Stuyvesant, the earlier bakery harassing governor of New Amsterdam, to being a noted business member of the community. Even now, he has an elementary school, 2 parks, and at least 1 building named after him. And I can't help but think that Chaim Potok had him in mind when titling his novel, I Am Asher Levy. But beyond his career as a kosher butcher, Asher Levy was also notable for joining the local militia, speaking up for the local Jewish population, and checking Stuyvesant's Protestant chauvinism in the settlement. Levy's staunch and continuous opposition to allowing Peter Stuyvesant to run roughshod over the rights of Jews and probably any other non-Dutch Reformed colony residents was at the base of the quarrel that brought Mr. Levy to my attention. New Amsterdam had butchers, and this meant people could access the type of meat needed to make into meatballs pretty regularly, commonly enough to make them an item in a cookbook that has instructions that includes the phrase, quote, take minced veal just like for meatballs, unquote, as if everyone knows what it means, which, judging by Dutch cuisine, everyone in charge of a stove did. And I'll keep digging into meatball history. Looking at American food history from this angle has made me curious. Food historians know that Italian immigrants did not bring spaghetti and meatballs with them. The meatball was an American addition. I'm going to have to keep poking at this one, as I have a kernel of an idea that the Italian-American meatball, which definitely has New York roots, might owe its existence to the 17th century New Amsterdam kitchen traditions. And maybe American meatloaf? I have questions. Now, where the Dutch really take a left from English cookery is in the frequent use of vegetables, and even the use of, gasp, raw vegetables. While pickled vegetables were common, making a salad of raw cabbage, kale, or other leafy greens chopped thinly, and then mixed with a dressing of hot fat, say butter or lard, and then vinegar and salt, or just oil and vinegar and salt in the summer, was a definite Dutch dish. The English would write in their letters or diaries about this odd coleslaw, served heet or cold, hot or cold. Raw salads of celery, artichokes, and even decorative and tasty additions of edible flowers like borage, rose, and calendula were common. The Dutch would even make soups of just vegetables and herbs, no peas at all. So very un-English. Along with the cabbages and kales or coleworts, lettuces, both leaf and head varieties, endives, sorrels, celery, asparagus, artichokes, chicory, dandelions, flowers and roots included, kohlrabi, onions, spinach, lamb's lettuce, or corn salad, which it was called that because it grows around the edges of grain fields, were all common on the Dutch table, along with a wide variety of pot herbs like parsley, chervil, tarragon, rocket, or arugula, and other easy-to-grow leaves that added flavor to many boiled, stewed, and baked things. Roots such as carrots, parsnips, turnips, and beets were common. Sweet potatoes had made it to Holland in the 16th century, and white potatoes followed them a bit later, but potatoes were still a bit of an oddity when the Dutch were setting up shop overseas. So New Amsterdam, well, by then it was New York, would have to wait until the 18th century to get white potatoes like everybody else in America. So, along with the meatball and the salad, the other place the Dutch are way ahead of the English colonists is in the dessert category. As I mentioned above, they had wheat, and they were on a pretty good international grocery shipping route, so they were getting sugar from the Dutch Caribbean. And yeah, a Dutch sugar plantation was no better than any other, so there was that. But this better, earlier access to sugar and wheat, along with plentiful butter from the imported Dutch dairy cows, meant that the Dutch pastry or pastijen game was far ahead. Single crust pies, the kind with just a crust on the bottom, no lid, of fruits and flavored custards were very available, along with the cookies, pretzels, and buns I mentioned earlier. Apple, pear, cherry, currant, gooseberry, quince, and even lemon or almond, if you were rich, were available. Savory pastijen were also common. Marrow, tongue, and types of mincemeat were typical. Covered meat pies, bird, fish, rabbit, and oyster were also typical. Regardless of their larger middle class, the Dutch still had a definite upper class, nobles and merchants, and combinations of the two. Because this was so, it is likely that a few households were consuming drinking chocolate in 17th century New Amsterdam. The delicacy had made it to Old Amsterdam and other trading centers by the end of the 16th century. And unlike potatoes, which were just, food, chocolate was a status symbol and traveled pretty well. So I feel safe in saying, almost certainly, chocolate drinking was going on in the Dutch colony, with all the imported mixing and drinking paraphernalia as well. The above foods were all very typical for Dutch dinners and suppers. The underlying food habits, cooked meat, a salad, and pie for dessert, has a very familiar feel to modern American food, especially if you hit up a mid-20th century diner-style restaurant, as long as you leave out the sandwiches and french fries. But if you add in diner breakfast foods, waffles and pancakes and omelets, it gets even harder to ignore the Dutch connection. The fact that diner culture has roots in New York again, I can't help but see the breadcrumbs leading back to this early Dutch influence on what we have made into American food. Oh, and the kicker for me? A typical Dutch New Amsterdam breakfast, cornmeal mush, and milk. The fact that pouring milk on our morning grainy foods, oatmeal, cream of wheat, and later our cornflakes and Wheaties and granola, it's not just a Dutch habit. And there are purely American influences that come into play starting in the 19th century. But it felt like a normal thing to the earliest colonists in not yet New York, and is a habit that looks different from breakfast habits in most of the rest of the world. So Dutch culinary habits have left a big stamp on American food. Sometimes it's so big we can't even see them. But going back to the beginning has allowed me to get something like a handle on what I think is a missing piece when people try to define American food. And just in time for the arrival of Christmas, which remember the Puritans went way out of their way to not celebrate. Heck, in 1647, during the English Civil War, they outlined a bunch of religious days like Easter and Christmas. So let's talk for a second about the Santa Claus versus Father Christmas thing. The English colonists, the ones who were okay with like a little gift exchange and mild idolatry, they would have spoken of the Captain of Christmas or Prince Christmas or Father Christmas. Mentioning St. Nicholas was decidedly rude and or dangerous after Henry VIII's tiff with the Pope. But those early Germans in Pennsylvania, they brought along Sankt Nicolaas. And the Dutch colonists, they had Sinterklaas. These are all based on that 3rd or 4th century bishop out of what is modern-day Turkey. Ha! Can't get away from Turkey, can we? And was designated the patron saint of children after one of those cool, impossible-sounding gory tales that were totally required back then for sainthood. Anyway, the Dutch version laundered into Santa Claus is the version of the name that has taken over the American landscape. How and why that all went down, and the development of the Christmas industrial complex is a topic for several future shows, thanks Victorians, starting in the 19th century, but not today. And that is where I will leave things for the 17th century Dutch. They didn't exactly invent modern American food, but they definitely did put into place habits that have shaped our current landscape, including the habit of picking up our favorite bits of food culture from other lands and rolling it into the national taste profile like it's always been there. I'll be back in the new year with the last few topics of the 17th century, on a weekly schedule and everything. Some are definitely Puritan approved, as they attempt to foster personal growth by exposing you to miserable facts. The Pilgrims are partial to information from biblical texts, but I'll be leaning on secondary sources that pull from 17th century diary entries and shipping records. But it won't all be self-improvement. There's still stimulants, rum, and spices to go as well. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description. Happy New Year.